Hey, it's Kyle here, and this is a bit of a long video. We are talking Artemis 3 here, but I think we can't really not mention that Artemis 1 has finally had its long-awaited launch, and it was a success. Ties were cut, handshakes were done, and the rocket went off without a hitch despite being left outside in a storm, which apparently resulted in some of the protective coating being ripped off. Thankfully, that didn't actually cause too much of an issue. Thankfully, everything went well with the launch, everything was nominal, as we like to say, and it's on its way to the moon at the moment. If you're watching this video in the future, you'll know the full outcome of the Artemis 1 mission. On screen, we're getting ready for Artemis 3, and Artemis 3 is a bit unusual. We're doing this video in two parts, and that's simply because it required me to build Starship from scratch, and having not played with a Starship style system in Kerbal before, it took me a little bit longer than I expected to make, and we also have to do multiple launches, which is why this video is almost 20 minutes long. NASA's original idea for getting to the moon was to have what they call a HLS, Human Landing System, docked at the Lunar Gateway, which could be reused and taken down. So whenever an Artemis mission would launch, the Orion capsule would dock at the Lunar Gateway before the crew transferred into the landing system. Unfortunately, the only contract they saw fit to award during their procurement process, despite this lovely render of the original placeholder, if you will, was to SpaceX for their Starship, and that's what we're building on the screen. We're building the Starship HLS, the Human Landing System, the Starship tanker, which is required for refueling, and SpaceX Super Heavy booster to boost both of them. These weren't exactly what I would call straightforward to build, probably because I'm not used to building rockets of this size. But what I decided to do was build the actual Lunar Lander first, and use that as a jumping off stage to build the Starship fueler along with the depot, and then repurposing a lot of the core components from that again to build the Super Heavy booster. These things are massive, and we are going to be trying to land as many of these boosters and components back on Kerbin as we can as part of this mission. There are going to be 4 launches in this video and 6 landings. And no, they won't all be perfect, because this is Kerbal Space Program. If there's not an explosion, it's not right. I have made some minor adjustments to how the Super Heavy booster is constructed, and that's simply it hasn't got as many engines. I think we've got 26 engines on it instead of the 33 that'll be flying on the real deal. And that's just simply because of scale and size, because this thing is truly gargantuan, even in Kerbal. And you'll be able to get a pretty good idea of that once you see it on the launch pad. But as we finish off our Super Heavy booster build, looks like we've ended up with 19 engines for the core, which, believe me, is more than enough on this scale. We are working predominantly with 5-meter diameter parts in Kerbal. We haven't gone up to the 7.5 because you can do this on the 5-meter scale, especially if all you're trying to do is get to the Mun. So with our first Starship stacked, I think it's time we head to the launch pad. And yes, I had an awful lot of fun putting that little bit together. So we are doing a pretty standard ascent here, and we have got our fueler on top and our Starship Heavy booster underneath. Now they're going to split apart, and we've got a new mod installed, and this one was one that I tried in the past, and one of our subscribers, I believe it was Viat Modder, suggested to give it another go, which I have. Now this is a mod called FMRS, the Flight Manager for Reusable Stages. As always, the links will be in the video description if you are interested. This creates a save point at the point of separation during a flight, which you can then jump back to and continue flying as if it was in real time. So that allows you to land boosters back at the Kerbal Space Center and recover their value and resources, or even Kerbals as well. Maybe you have a Kerbal who's in a drop can who you're going to drop off on a moon as you go past, and you can do that and continue on and then skip back and do that landing so it's nice and safe. But you might have noticed that we've gotten ourselves into a nice little orbit there with 2,600 meters a second of delta V. Now, this is going to be our fueler, and this is where we're going to be heading up with our next 2 flights to deposit liquid fuel and oxygen for it to then pass onto the HLS when it does eventually dock with it. There's not really an awful lot to say about it. It's just going to be sitting there as a fuel tank, and unfortunately, because it doesn't have solar panels, it's going to keep running out of power. But with it now safely in its low Kerbal orbit, we can now head back in time using the FMRS to booster separation. There's no Starship tanker in sight, but we're going to turn around and do the classic SpaceX boost back maneuver. We do not have a giant pair of chopsticks to catch our super heavy booster or a Mechazilla just kind of hanging around, so we're going to go for the tried and tested land on the engine cones, because that hasn't went poorly for anyone ever. No, absolutely not. Now, as mentioned, suicide burn's not my forte, and then because of trajectories and several other things being set to high, it kind of froze for a moment there, and we just gradually brought the booster safely down to the ground. And I gotta be honest, I love, with all the little visual mods I've put on there, how much you get of that little ground scatter. Oh no. Oh, no explosion. Any landing you will walk away from, as they say. This means it's time to do our second launch, which is a refueling run. This also has the almost identical tanker on top of the super heavy booster as we saw in the last launch. However, this one has been identified by having a nice NASA sticker on it, so I know which one was meant to be getting fueled up and which one wasn't. For those curious as to how I'm choosing when to do my booster separation so that we can successfully do a boost back, I remember reading somewhere online someone said 500 meters a second was the cutoff point. So if you are launching, you've got 500 meters a second left on your first stage, that's the time to separate. And it's actually worked out pretty good. I think it might actually be even lower. It might be closer to about 400. But with 500, you end up with about 1,000 meters a second, if not higher, to do your boost back. And then you normally need about 400 meters a second to do a successful landing, provided you've got some way to slow yourself down, whether that's air brakes or fins, whatever it might be. I consistently tried to use about 500 meters a second as the cutoff point for separation, and it worked pretty much every time, so hopefully that'll help some of you out there if you're trying to do something similar with FMRS. On screen, I'm currently working on getting a rendezvous with our fueling tank, our depot. And this is made a little bit easier if you wait until the object you're trying to rendezvous with is overhead at the time of launch, because then all you have to do is catch up a little bit instead of make a massive orbital adjustment because you're half an orbit out of sync. So it does make it a little bit easier, a bit more efficient on your fuel use as well. Now, to get that fuel across, SpaceX haven't actually shown how they're going to dock these 2 monolithic structures in space and transfer fuel between them safely. So that's meant I've kind of had to wing this a bit, and seeing as our upper stage engines are clustered in 3s and then surrounded by another 3s, I figured, why not 3 small docking ports on pistons? And those pistons extend at the press of a action group, which in this case is 0. They can slowly connect to each other and then retract once they're done transferring the fuel. It means they're out of the way as well for any of the gimbling of the engine cones. We've successfully rendezvoused with our fuel depot in low Kerbin orbit, and as you can see, we're just getting ready to line up and then begin the docking process. So we've extended those pistons with the docking clamps on the end, and we're going to slowly back them up and connect them to the ones on the depot. This was by no means straightforward. There was actually a slight issue with the amount of fuel we had remaining and the amount of energy, actually, the actual amount of power we had on board on the fuel depot. I'm not sure if this was just an issue with how I had warp hibernation set up for the tanker, or if it was keeping SAS on even when it wasn't meant to be in use. But it did mean that there was an issue with the amount of power, monopropellant, everything else on board with it, and I will end up losing contact with the fuel depot a couple more times in this video because it simply wasn't able to stay powered up. Thankfully, I found a few workarounds to prevent the issue. I could apparently just reload the craft by loading a save where it was and then reloading my current save, and that would fix the amount of electricity within it for some reason, which leads me to think it might be to do with FMRS and the way it saves states. I need to have a bit of a look into that. But it's about time for us to begin our re-entry maneuver, and this was weird. There's no simple way to put that. Like, I understand how Starship is meant to do its belly flop maneuver, and in Kerbal, I'm sure you could do that very successfully and very safely. But alas, I'm not that good of a Kerbal pilot, at least in my humble opinion. And I also managed to leave 3 times time warp on while I was doing it. And you might notice something a little bit unusual, because that surely should have destroyed it. There's no question in my mind. That impact, which was 30 meters a second, should have ripped the rocket apart. So very lucky on that account. We do need to go back to the boosters. This is the second booster. Something went a bit odd with the FMRS save on this, and I'm not sure why, but I had to load it manually anyway. And then it was night. So I either loaded the wrong one from when I was testing the booster, or maybe it was an error with the timing. When I clicked it, it decided to do it at the same time on Kerbal at the KSC as to when I'd actually hit the button. Either way, a landing is a landing. And I think, yes, this was a complete success. So I'm quite happy with that as well. So it's on to launch 3 of the second refueling run, and we are going cinematic for this. I've been playing around with a mod called Camera Tools, which lets you control the camera in a more cinematic point of view, and you would have saw earlier examples of this during the first launch where I did that nice little close-up on the booster. If you're looking to create cinematic shots in Kerbal, Camera Tools Continued is basically a must. It's got so many useful little tweaks in there that make it so much fun to play with and let you capture beautiful shots like this classic Apollo shot of the separation. As always, details are down in the video description on where you can get it. And with what somehow sounded like an advert for something free over, we should probably talk about why Starship is being used in the first place. So Starship HLS, or the Starship Human Landing System, is going to be the Lunar Lander variant of Starship, and that's going to transfer astronauts from lunar orbit to the surface of the moon and back. It will of course require the Super Heavy booster to launch it into Earth orbit, and once in orbit it will then dock with a propellant depot, which is basically just also another version of Starship. These propellant depots are going to be launched into Earth orbit, then partially or fully filled by between 4 and 14 Starship tanker flights. That's a lot of launches just to get to the moon. Many of the drawings we've seen for the fuel depot suggest it will be larger than Starship, but as there's currently no official drawings or designs to go off, I've opted to simply set one of the tankers as the depot for this series of launches. In the case of our mission here in Kerbal, we only need to fill our fuel depot twice for it to be usable by our Starship HLS, and we're able to fill it to maximum capacity in just under 3 launches. So once this depot has been filled up, a Starship HLS will then launch and rendezvous with the already loaded up propellant depot. It will refuel itself, and then it will transition from Earth orbit to lunar orbit. And that's where it's going to rendezvous with the Orion spacecraft, and that's also going to launch on an SLS. So that's at least 5 rocket launches just to get a landing craft this size to the moon. Crew will then dock, transfer into Starship HLS, descend to the surface of the moon for a stay of several days, and then they're going to conduct quite a few EVAs, and this is one of the major advantages that Starship's HLS system has. Because of its large capacity, it can carry a substantially larger amount of resources for things like EVAs and other expeditions on the surface. And this could come in quite handy for those initial landings where they're trying to figure out where would be a viable location to set up camp at the moon's south pole. Once all that work is out the way, Starship will take off from the lunar surface to rendezvous with Orion, reunite the crews, and send them on their way home. If you've been watching some of my other Artemis videos, you might be wondering, what about that lovely space station? Wasn't that meant to be the main docking spot? And yes, essentially this completely upended how they're planning to do it. Originally, the plan was to have a lander stay at the lunar gateway for it to be refueled there and constantly go back down to the lunar surface and back, basically serving as a taxi. Unfortunately, with the options that were presented to NASA, the only one which they felt was suitable and could be delivered within the time frame they'd set out was SpaceX's massive Starship. And unfortunately, with the current setup there, it doesn't appear it was a viable option for it to go and dock with the Lunar Gateway and then transition from there. So what they're planning to do is to send Starship HLS into an orbit and loiter and wait for Orion to arrive before transferring the crew and then heading down to the surface. In the meantime, Orion will stay in orbit and conduct observational science, with 2 of the flight crew staying on board and another 2 descending to the surface. And on the note of descending, we are bringing down fuel tanker Beta, and this one did not go very well. As you can see, quite a bit of lag and not very much of Starship left. Success? Perhaps. So let's try and land something else successfully. We'll go back to the Super Heavy booster and we'll begin our boost back, and hopefully this one will not explode either. We managed to get into the burn back position quite easily and rotate back to the re-entry position without too much fuss, which sometimes can be a little bit of a headache with these big heavy boosters. And as we begin that final little bit of re-entry burn, you can see I overcooked it a little bit. But I did manage to recover quite successfully, I think. We managed to touch down our 3rd super heavy booster without it exploding. So that's a win in my book, especially after the prior detonation. Which means it's time for the main event. Well, I'd say that was a fairly nominal launch despite the big explosive music for bad things to happen. So as we head up into the upper atmosphere, we are of course going to, as you've probably seen 3 times already in this video, separate from the super heavy booster and boot up those upper stage engines, which sound a little bit like a transformer for some reason. But while we make our way up into low Kerbal orbit to rendezvous with the fuel depot, let's talk about Starship HLS, because it's gone through a lot of revisions since it was first announced. On screen is a comparison of the old Starship HLS versus the new version, which has started to appear in all of SpaceX's media. You'll see now that the windows have changed, there are more solar panel placements all over the craft, it's got a wider leg base, and 24 small landing thrusters positioned higher up the body, as opposed to 9 on the old one. These changes were all made because these are more in line with what it's actually going to look like, whereas the original version we saw everywhere was just an artist's rendition based on what had been submitted to NASA for the contract. And with that in mind, it could be that between now and 2024, 2025, that the design again changes, depending on how the test flights for Starship and Super Heavy go. Solar arrays could be changed if they struggle with air resistance, the landing engines could be repositioned for better usage, or the number of them could be changed. Even the inclusion of windows or that proposed lift could be altered if they're too problematic for use on the moon. And I can see moon dust being a particular problem for the lift's rotors, if we're being honest. Not so much for liftoff, thankfully. That's a nice advantage they've got with it being a lot higher up. They won't have that blast back that Apollo had issues with. Back to the mission at hand, and we have arrived at the fuel depot for the last time in this video. So as we slowly approach and line up those 3 docking ports, I did make some slight adjustments to the original design. I actually extended those docking adapters out a little bit further because I was finding we were having trouble acquiring all 3 of those clamps and having them stick. And you would have saw that on previous docks where there was a fair bit of shake and wobble between the 2 crafts. So if you are attempting to do this, actually make sure all 3 of those clamps do extend past the bottom of the skirt of the engine once they're extended. And turn off SLS as well, as both crafts are going to try to correct for one another, and the pistons really aren't strong enough for that to be usable. But as you can see, we have completed our refueling. We are up to a rather impressive 4,337 meters a second of delta V, which is more than enough to get us to the Mun and back and land. So it's probably about time we got on our way to the Mun. And as you can see, we have got our encounter lined up. We've done our lunar insertion burn, and we've got ourselves into a pretty normal orbit. Now, why have I done this instead of putting ourselves in that near rectilinear halo orbit that we did in the previous video for the Lunar Gateway? Quite simply, it's unclear what the mission plan is at this stage for Starship. And as this is going to be sitting there for a while as we organise to get our SLS booster up and running and take Orion out to the Mun, I felt like it made more sense to make sure we could easily rendezvous with Starship as opposed to putting ourselves in a tricky situation where we have to have a very specific launch window. And that's why I decided to put ourselves in a standard orbit around the moon's equator. We will then use Starship's excessive amount of fuel to put ourselves in that near rectilinear halo orbit once we have docked with Orion, and then proceed to do our landing, which will have to wait for another video as we are now well over 20 minutes in time. So it's time to jump back and land one more booster. As this is the last landing of the video, a question has emerged. Have I gotten any better at landing these things? Have I managed to master the correct timing and thrust-to-weight ratio for seamless SpaceX-style landing? Will I have crowds of people cheering for me in mission control and offering up their Doge coins so I can send them to the moon? Sadly, no. I think I may have gotten worse, if I'm perfectly honest. We have successfully done a lot, however. We have launched a fuel depot, refueled it twice, then fueled up our Starship Human Landing System to head off to the Mun. We successfully landed 5 out of our 6 boosters, and technically we could claim that fuel abater died from a malicious Kraken Attack, combined with 3 times time warp. Maybe. Next time, we'll be heading back to the launch pad with SLS and introducing the potential crew for Artemis 3's lunar landing mission. And based on NASA's history, I have a feeling these 4 astronauts are definitely in the running for that first moon landing. We broke the 100 subscriber milestone earlier this week and are now very much on our way to 200, so thank you so much to everyone who's come on board. Any thoughts, comments, or space puns, drop them in the comment section below, and until next time, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next pass.